the House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Eternal God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. On this day, we ask your blessing on the men and women, citizens all, whose votes have populated this people's house. Each member of this house has been given the sacred duty of representing them. O Lord, we pray that those with whom our representatives might meet during this coming long weekend in their home districts be blessed with peace and an assurance that they have been listened to. We ask your blessing now on the members of this House, whose responsibility lies also beyond the local interest of constituents while honoring them. Give each member the wisdom to represent both local and national interests, a responsibility calling for the wisdom of Solomon. Grant them, if you will, a double portion of such wisdom. Bless us this day and every day, and may all that is done within the people's house be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The chair will entertain up to 5 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much has been said about the tumultuous times in which we live, and it's true. We do face enormous challenges, but I would like to remind the American people of the things that will get us through these times. My parents were part of the greatest generation. My father was a pilot in World War II, and I'm honored to wear his Air Force wings. My mother was the mother of 10 amazing children, many of which are with me today. They are the best friends that I have ever had. Our parents taught us something that each of us has embroidered and now hangs on our individual family walls, and it is this. Our family's motto is duty, honor, service to God, family, and country. We are, as Abraham Lincoln said, the last best hope on earth. That was true when he said it. It is still true today. We created the miracle of the Constitution. We survived the catastrophe of the Civil War. We defeated communism, totalitarianism, fascism. We have the strength to get through the challenges that we face today, but it will only be true if we are true to that principle: duty, honor, service to God, family, and country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Hawaii seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, for far too long, Big Pharma has played by its own rules, benefiting from skyrocketing drug prices on the backs of our most vulnerable populations. Now, back in 2003, legislation was passed establishing Medicare Part D to make prescription drugs more affordable for people. But Big Pharma lobbyists influenced those policies and made it so there was a provision included that would ban the Secretary of Health and Human Services from negotiating lower prices directly with pharmaceutical companies, something that the VA can already do today. Over 42 million Americans who are enrolled in Medicare Part D continue to face rising costs on brand name drugs, fewer generic drugs, and higher premiums, making it difficult, if not impossible, for many to fill their prescriptions. I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Act to take back our health care from pharmaceutical companies and allow the Secretary of HHS to negotiate drug prices directly with manufacturers to secure affordable, life-saving medication for millions of Americans. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the House Judiciary Committee approved the Legal Workforce Act, a bill I introduced that saves jobs for citizens and legal workers. It requires U.S. employers to use the E-Verify system to check the work eligibility of all future hires. A September 2017 Washington Post ABC News poll shows that 82% of voters favor requiring business owners to check the immigration status of prospective employees. E-Verify is the most popular immigration reform that reduces illegal immigration. E-Verify is a free and quick system that already is used voluntarily by employers to cover 1/3 of the workforce. The Legal Workforce Act has the backing of both national business organizations and immigration enforcement groups. This bill deserves the enthusiastic support of all members of Congress who want to put the interest of American workers first.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, today House Republicans will move one step closer to giving a budget-busting $2 trillion tax cut to the super wealthy on the backs of hard-working Americans. One step closer to increasing taxes on vulnerable Americans. One step closer to gutting Medicaid by $1 trillion and slashing Medicare by $500 billion, one step closer to decimating programs that help veterans, seniors, students, and families. Many families in my home district in Ohio are struggling because they haven't had a pay increase in over a decade. That is why, instead of pushing the Donald Trump's Billionaires First tax cut plan, we need to ensure that all Americans have a chance to achieve an American dream by expanding the earned tax income credit, child tax credit, and low housing income tax credit, not capping retirement contributions and eliminating tax loopholes that allow U.S. companies to profit from shipping jobs overseas. Mr. Speaker, it is time that we provide a level playing field for all families to truly help them have a better life. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to share the story of C.J. Rudolph of Sellersville, Pennsylvania. C.J. was born in December 2015 at Grandview Hospital. Before he was born, he tested positive for the trisomy 21 gene, meaning that he was going to be born with Down syndrome. But his parents, Chris and Donna, had faith he would be a fighter. From day one, CJ battled just to stay alive. He had 2 heart defects and was immediately put in the neonatal ICU. As the condition became more critical, he was transferred to the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia and ultimately ended up at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. After 5 weeks at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, at the age of 58 days, CJ underwent heart surgery performed by a miracle worker named Dr. Spray. 4 days later, CJ was finally able to come home with his parents. Mr. Speaker, at almost 2 years old, CJ has overcome more obstacles than many of us will face in a lifetime. Today, CJ serves as the inspiration of the Sellersville Fire Department and continues to inspire all those he encounters with his grit and perseverance. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 580, I call up the House Concurrent Resolution 71 with a Senate amendment thereto. I have a motion at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution, designate the Senate amendment, and designate the motion.
House Concurrent Resolution 71, concurrent resolution establishing the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2018 and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2019 through 2027. Senate amendment. Mrs. Black of Tennessee moves that the House concur in the Senate amendment to the House Concurrent Resolution 71.
Pursuant to House Resolution 580, the motion shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget. The gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Black, and the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I rise today in support of Senate Amendment House Concurrent Resolution 71, the budget resolution for fiscal 2018. Passing a budget is never easy, and it has once again been a challenge this year. But I am encouraged with where we are now, and I am pleased that the Senate did its work by approving a budget, one that we can support in order to unlock tax reform for the American people. Without question, there are plenty of things that I wish were included in what the Senate passed, ideas that the House put forward earlier this month when we approved our budget. For example, I still feel strongly about addressing unsustainable mandatory spending, and that hasn't changed. The growing burden of debt caused by mandatory spending is a real problem that cannot be ignored. We owe it to the American people to do something, to offer serious reforms that ensure government programs are financially sustainable and working well for generations to come. And I think we will tackle this important issue in the future. Really, we don't have a choice. But despite any shortcomings of the Senate-passed budget, I'm encouraged that it does reflect the shared priorities of both chambers. Moving forward with this budget is also supported by our President. I want to remind my colleagues that before final passage last week, the Senate did include numerous provisions previously passed by the House. And I was proud to be involved in those negotiations with the leaders of the House, the Senate, and the White House. For example, the Senate-passed budget creates a mechanism that would permit the Budget Committee chairman to adjust the budget allocations if there is future legislation signed into law that revises the BCA spending caps. The Senate-passed budget also includes numerous improvements to the House budget's enforcement that are designed to strengthen fiscal discipline. Because we work together to find a common ground, we can move ahead toward tax reform and expand upon the ideas in the conservative framework unveiled last month. Throughout nearly my 7 years as a member of the House, Republicans have talked about modernizing our outdated and overly complicated tax system. And today we have the opportunity to take that next big step to unlock tax reform for the American people, fulfilling the promise that we made long ago to our constituents. By advancing tax reform, we can help Americans keep more of their hard-earned paychecks. We can make it possible for most Americans to file their taxes on a simple postcard. We can level the playing field for business and help them compete better globally. And we can empower entrepreneurs and small businesses, encouraging them to create more jobs. This budget acknowledges that our economy is in desperate need of a jolt, and the tax cuts included in the Senate-passed budget hold that promise of doing just that. Put simply, we have the opportunity to make history by reforming our tax system for the first time in nearly 3 decades. President Trump is with us on this, and I agree that we must move quickly. And that's why I urge my colleagues to pass this budget today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the bill we are debating today is not a real effort at responsible budgeting. It is a means to an end, a single-minded plan to make it easier to enact tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations, regardless of the consequences for everyone else. If approved by the House today, an irresponsible $1.5 trillion tax bill will come to the floor in a matter of weeks. It is being rushed because Republicans don't want the American people to know what's in it. They don't want you to find out that it overwhelmingly benefits the wealthy while increasing taxes on millions of middle-class families. Rushing through legislation that impacts nearly every American family and business is reckless, and voting on a bill that rewrites our nation's tax code a week or two after it is introduced without any real input from the people who will be impacted is negligent. But that's what you do when you can't defend your own policy. And there's a lot of unjustifiable provisions in this budget. On top of massive tax cuts for the rich, it cuts vital national investments, threatening our economic progress and our national security. It cuts more than $4 trillion in mandatory spending, including nearly $2 trillion from Medicare and Medicaid alone. The enormity of these cuts and the severity of the consequences for American families cannot be overstated. But more cuts will be coming once the Republican tax cuts blow an enormous hole in the budget. We will see a tax on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, nutrition assistance, on important benefits that help American families get ahead. I know my Republican colleagues desperately want to believe that the tax cuts in their budget will pay for themselves and usher in a new era of economic growth. Or at least they want the American people to believe that. But the record is clear. This approach has failed time and time again. And now, even though the evidence and experts have concluded that these tax cuts will not create an economic boom, but will instead lead to a higher concentration of wealth among the rich while dramatically increasing deficits and debt, my Republican colleagues are trying to do it again. Everything we do in Congress should be about making the lives of American families better and more secure. We owe them a budget that invests in their future, a tax code that is fair, and a full and honest debate on both. This budget and the tax cuts that will follow are a failure on all fronts. I therefore urge my Republican colleagues to abandon this dangerous budget and start addressing the needs and priorities of the American people. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on the Senate amendment to House Concurrent Resolution 71. It is now my honor to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank the chairwoman of the Budget Committee for yielding me time. And Mr. Speaker, we need to pass this budget not only to rein in out-of-control spending, but also to give Congress the go-ahead on much-needed tax reform. We need to reduce the tax burden on hardworking Americans. The typical household in the 21st District of Texas pays over $15,700 in federal taxes. Past experience shows that tax relief generates strong economic growth. It enables Americans to save, invest, create jobs, and spend more of their income. Our vision of tax reform benefits families across America. For example, in my congressional district, 1/6 of households utilize the child tax credit. Increasing the child tax credit will help families keep more of their hard-earned money to use on child care or parental leave, school supplies, college savings, and other expenses associated with raising a child. Let's help American families enjoy a more prosperous future rather than pay more of their hard-earned dollars to the federal government. Now yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Washington, a distinguished member of the House Budget Committee and Ways and Means Committee, Ms. Delbene.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this budget proposal. With many working families and businesses still struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing economy, our top priority in Congress should be helping expand opportunities to sustain long-term economic growth and security so no American is left behind. Unfortunately, the bill we're voting on today is not a serious budget designed to help middle-class families. Instead, this budget is simply a vehicle to to rush through a partisan tax proposal using a process known as reconciliation. And what's worse, the Ryan McConnell tax plan would add trillions of dollars to the deficit, making our children foot the bill for tax cuts that disproportionately benefit the wealthiest. In fact, the Tax Policy Center has estimated that the Ryan McConnell tax plan could raise taxes by an average of $1,209 a year on families earning between $50,000 and $150,000 a year. This is moving in the wrong direction. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is now my honor to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the fiscal year 2018 budget resolution, which is a critical first step to achieving comprehensive tax reform and making the American economy great again. I also applaud Chairman Diane Black for her leadership in producing this budget. Our nation has not significantly reformed our tax code in more than 3 decades, which has allowed the tax code to explode in complexity and unnecessary burden on hardworking American families and businesses. Moreover, while the United States is a world leader in innovation and entrepreneurship, we have failed to reduce our corporate tax rate, which stands at 35%, the highest in the development world. And I would add, corporations don't pay tax, the American people pay tax. The unified framework unveiled earlier this year will simplify the tax code for everyone. It will eliminate wasteful tax loopholes and reduce taxes on businesses. I am also pleased to see that the plan eliminates the death tax on farmers and moves to full expensing. Under this plan, the average family will see an increase in income between $4,000 and $9,000 annually. While I believe this budget is necessary to spur economic growth and increase wages, I'm extremely disappointed that the Senate removed the $203 billion of mandatory spending cuts, given the challenge the national debt poses to our great United States. However, we should not make the perfect the enemy of the good. And I understand that issues as complex as the budget and tax reform require compromise. I appreciate the leadership of Speaker Ryan, Chairman Brady, and the rest of the leadership team for their hard work on tax reform, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to moving tax reform over the finish line and to President Trump's desk. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Washington, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Jaya Paul.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Yarmouth, for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this fiscal year 18 budget resolution for a number of reasons, not the least of which that the underlying assumptions are grossly misleading. It assumes fictions like hundreds of billions of dollars from the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and it assumes an economic growth rate of 3%, which most economists on both sides do not believe is possible. This budget is merely a vehicle for Republicans to fast-track tax cuts for millionaires, billionaires, and large corporations. Any assertion of cuts for working families is debunked by experts like Leonard Berman, co-founder of the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, who has called this utterly implausible. Mr. Chairman, the facts are this. 80% of the Republican tax cuts go to the top 1% by 2027. The average tax cut for the top 1% in 2027 will be $207,000. 42 million middle-class households will face a tax increase, including those earning between $50,000 and $150,000, who will see a tax increase of 1/3. That is what this budget lays the path for. If we want to see where this will lead, let's just look at Kansas, a place where a Republican legislature has rolled back the tax cuts that they passed from several years ago because they simply didn't work and put Kansas's economy into a downward spiral. We know who wins under this budget resolution. Simply paves the way for a huge tax cut for the wealthiest millionaires, billionaires, and corporations. That's wrong, and I urge a no vote on this budget. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is now my honor to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, also a member of the Budget Committee, Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, unsustainable government spending drives both taxes and debt. Now, the budget resolution sets the spending architecture for the fiscal year. The House version provided for $200 billion of enforceable mandatory spending reductions over 10 years and balanced within the decade. The Senate amendments gut these provisions, squandering the one opportunity Congress has each year to bring mandatory spending under control, taking us another year closer to a sovereign debt crisis. This is tragic, and I condemn it in the strongest terms. The Senate, though, has retained just one key provision from the House budget. It makes tax reform possible this year. Tax reform is essential to economic growth, and economic growth is essential to confront our debt. Now, many are alarmed that it provides for $1.5 trillion of additional debt, but this is due solely to the Senate's rules that require tax cuts to be scored only as revenue losses without taking into account economic expansion. Now, during the Obama years, our economy grew at an average of 1.5% annually. That's about half the average rate since World War II. Reagan averaged 3.5%. Reagan did this by reducing the tax burdens that were crushing our economy. He slashed the top income tax rate from 70% down to 28%, and income tax receipts nearly doubled because of the economic expansion he unleashed. Taxes driven by spending are the greatest threat to our economy today, and debt driven by spending is the greatest threat to our future. Controlling spending is currently impossible in the Senate. So it's obvious that we can't balance the budget and reduce our debt without significantly increasing economic growth. We can't increase economic growth without tax relief, and we can't get tax relief without the provisions in the Senate budget. Arthur Laffer, the architect of the Reagan tax policy, forecasts that the corporate tax reform alone will increase GDP growth at a rate that should generate a temporary bump of 5%, settling down to an average of 2.6% over the decade. This will add $5 trillion to the American economy and directly increase revenues to all levels of government between $1.8 and $2 trillion. Now, we've tried a static approach to tax policy during the Obama years. The economy stagnated and the debt doubled. I remember what it was like in the Reagan era. Wages were rising, opportunities for better jobs were everywhere. There was a sense of optimism that comes with prosperity and abundance. When we abandoned these policies, we lost that prosperity to a decade of despair. I want my kids to know what sense of relief and optimism was like, what it feels like when morning dawns again in the American economy. This resolution starts that transformation, and I urge its adoption.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I should remind the prior speaker, my friend from California, that Arthur Laffer was also the architect of the Kansas plan, which was disastrous for that state. So citing him as a source, I'd be a little bit careful. Now I'm happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from California, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee and the Appropriations Committee, Ms. Lee.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the gentleman for yielding and for his tremendous leadership. And also, just very briefly, I just want to mention to my colleague from California on the other side, I remember the Reagan-era tax cut period also, and there was a huge rise in homeless veterans as a result, unfortunately. I rise in strong opposition to the so-called budget plan. I know that our budget shapes our national priorities and values, but the Republicans have put forward a budget that I think is downright sinister. This budget is morally bankrupt. It's a Trojan horse that steals health care from children and rips food from the hungry just to fast-track $1.5 million in tax breaks to billionaires and corporations. Budgets are moral documents. They should not be rigged in favor of special interests and the wealthy few. But the cruel and, it's a crooked Republican budget. It does just that. Our nation's budget should prioritize working families and the middle class, too many of whom are making low wages and living below the poverty line. It should assist those struggling to find a job. It should invest in workforce training, education, job creation, and job training. Instead, this Republican budget creates tax cuts for billionaires, millionaires, and corporations. Our budget should expand to protect health care for all. Instead, this budget steals nearly $2 trillion from life-saving Medicaid and Medicare. And with nearly 40 million Americans living in poverty, our budget should invest in communities of color and rural communities which have higher rates of poverty. Simply put, the House Republican budget would push more people into poverty. It slashes programs that help create good-paying jobs for struggling families. It's a shame, it's immoral, it's un-American, and I hope we defeat it.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just must make a comment on what went on in Kansas and the attribution that this was Mr. Laffer's idea. I know Mr. Laffer personally and have had a conversation with him about his plan and suggestion. It was not followed. So I do want to lift up his good name and say that was not, his plan was not followed. So with that, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to congratulate our Chairman Black on the markup of this important piece of legislation out of the Budget Committee. As we all know, tax season is the worst. It evokes images of stress, accountants, lawyers, and American families sending hard-earned money to the federal government. I, for one, have never been excited when it is tax season, and as a business owner, it took on a whole new meaning. Taxes affect all Americans, but tax season shouldn't include months and months of preparation, often required to hire tax professionals. Our tax code is broken, and millions of Americans are looking to us to fix it. That's why Republicans have released the Unified Tax Reform Framework to provide relief for hardworking Americans and jumpstart our economy. First, it lowers taxes at every income level, allowing Americans to keep more of their hard-earned paychecks. It delivers the lowest tax rates in modern history for job creators, allowing them to invest in growing their business. And I remind you that the small business community is responsible for 70% of all new jobs created. The vast majority of taxpayers will no longer have to deal with the complexity of itemizing due to the increased standard deduction. Small businesses will no longer be taxed under the individual side of the code. Families will no longer be penalized for inheriting family property or businesses when the death tax is removed. Finally, we will cut tax rates on personal savings and investment in half. Americans should invest in their local economies and build towards a more financially secure future without exorbitant taxes. Now is the time for tax reform, and today we take a big step towards action. We must pass this budget. Hardworking Americans across the nation will have the same April 15th they always have if we don't, and that is unacceptable. We cannot miss this opportunity. President Trump is with us on tax reform, and we must act for the American people.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I urge all of my colleagues to support this budget. It is critical to the American people, and I yield back.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Boyle.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose the billionaire's budget. That's exactly what the Republican budget is. 79.7% of it goes to the richest 1%. On top of that, who pays for it? The middle class and working class families of my district. Some 50 million Americans will be paying more in taxes, not less, as a result of this tax plan. Now, I have nothing against the billionaires that my friends on the other side are so eager to help. I just don't think the working class and middle class families of my district should be paying for their tax cuts. We should instead have a budget that focuses on building the middle class out, on lifting up those who've been working for the last 15 years and not getting a pay increase. This budget does absolutely nothing for those families. Zero. And on top of all of this, it adds $1.5 trillion to our national debt. It is wrong. It does not do anything to help the great American middle class, and it must be rejected. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky Reserves. Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's now my honor to yield 2 minutes to a member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Johnson from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the time. You know, I hear it all the time, and it's just a false narrative. This idea that the tax reform package presented by Republicans is only a tax relief for the wealthy, and that the middle class and low income families are not going to benefit from it, it's just absolutely untrue. We're talking about doubling the standard deduction. Millions of Americans aren't even going to pay any taxes. That's particularly important in rural areas like I represent in Ohio. And so, you know, I would urge my colleagues, let's stop this false narrative that says that this is just a tax cut for the wealthy, because that's not true. And by the way, when you cut taxes on businesses and corporations, who pays those taxes, Mr. Speaker? It's the American people who buy the products that pay those taxes. When they get a break, everybody wins. Look, the adoption of the Senate amendment to the House-passed budget that we're going to vote on today paves the way for tax reform. It's going to establish a path to balance through restrained spending, reduced taxes, and economic growth. It's going to allow for higher defense spending contingent on future adjustments to discretionary spending caps for defense and national security. But it begins to address our national debt. It reduces non-defense discretionary spending by over $600 billion over 10 years. It assumes more than $4 trillion in mandatory savings over 10 years. And it provides for budget enforcement in the House in order to strengthen fiscal discipline. Madam Chair, Mr. Speaker, this is a responsible path forward. The American people are screaming for a simpler, fairer, flatter tax code, one that makes American workers competitive, one that lets the American people keep more of what they earn in their pockets. With that, I urge my colleagues to support today's vote, pass this budget amendment, and let's get on to tax reform. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, the Assistant Democratic Leader, Mr. Clyburn.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, the document before us is a partisan exercise to deliver large tax cuts to the wealthy. Working Americans will see their taxes go up, and our children and grandchildren will have to pay back the debt Republicans will create to finance these tax cuts. While they promise the American people revenue-neutral tax reform that will simplify the tax code and close costly loopholes, the budget they are ramming through will borrow $1.5 trillion to finance these cuts. It will precipitate cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and other safety net programs upon which middle-income families depend. It proposes to eliminate the deduction for state and local taxes, increasing the tax burden on over 500,000 people in my home state of South Carolina. This document threatens to earn income tax credit and lowers the ceiling on middle-income savings and eliminates the inheritance tax, which only affects those with estates valued over $11 million. It creates a pass-through for businesses that pay zero corporate taxes, effectively giving the owners of these companies a lower individual rate than the people they employ. If the Republicans would engage us, we could produce a bipartisan tax plan that would expand the earned income tax credit for single individuals and the child tax credit for working families. We could produce a bipartisan tax plan that would end the preferential treatment of investment income, which undermines working Americans while enriching wealthy investors. We stand ready to engage with the other side. Until then, we will be resolute in our opposition to this unfair, immoral document. And now yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's now my honor to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, a member of both our Budget Committee and the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, sir, and I want to first thank the chairwoman for a phenomenal job. Look, our current fiscal environment, according to the CBO, they project that the growth of our economy will be 2% or less for the next decade. I'm reminded of what a good friend and colleague, Democratic colleague in the Budget Committee said one day, that 3% growth, that's just a dream. That's unrealistic. And yet, before the storms hit, what did we see as far as our economic growth of the country? 3.1% economic growth, something that one of our colleagues, Democratic colleagues, said was a pipe dream. And this is in large part because of excessive regulations and have been curtailed by both the administration and by Congress. But to keep that momentum, we need to pass tax reform. It will lead to a sustained, strong economy. It will again lower the burden, tax burden to our families. It will lead to increased wages for families, for the middle class, for individuals, for the first time in such a long time. Allow the American people to keep more of their hard-earned money. It would make small and large and mid-sized businesses more competitive so they can create millions of additional jobs here in the United States. Mr. Speaker, this legislation will allow us to do real tax reform to keep the economy growing, to get the economy going, to get the American people working again. And this is an essential part, so I would urge for everyone's support. With that, I yield back. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from California, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Carbajal.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member Yarmouth. Snake oil. Snake oil is all that this Republican budget will give to the American middle class and working families. This Republican budget before Congress is squarely aimed at ramming through a tax plan without bipartisan consensus or input. This proposed tax plan will increase our deficit, adding $1.5 trillion over the next decade, and it leaves the middle class stuck, footing the bill with an increase in their annual federal taxes. In fact, 80% of the tax cuts in this plan benefits only the wealthiest 1% of Americans. That means those benefits are geared towards those earning $900,000 a year or more. 1 in 3 middle-class families making between $50,000 and $150,000 will see their taxes go up. One proposal that Republicans have put forth to pay for their plan is eliminating the state and local tax deduction. This will cost Central Coast homeowners and families in my district over $15,000 a year on average. As a member of the Budget Committee, I encourage my colleagues to reject this plan and to get to work on bipartisan negotiations for lasting tax reform that benefits middle-class families. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And there's an old saying that the devil is in the details. And those details have not been released yet. So it is difficult for me to understand how my colleagues on the other side of the aisle make assumptions on just what this tax plan will do, calling it things such as snake oil, when I can assure you that as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, it is our goal and intent that the people in the middle and low income categories will see a tax relief. I also want to remind them that what we know was the devil in the details is the details given to the American people a number of years ago on the Affordable Care Act, which is neither affordable or caring in my opinion, was that people would see a return of about $2,500 on the average in their pocket as a result of the Affordable Care Act's policies. And what we saw and what we're seeing now is a big increase in those premiums. Certainly they've not received $2,500 in their pocket. They were told they could keep their doctor, which we knew wasn't true, and the other kinds of things that were done that caused people to lose their insurance. In my very own state, where because we had a plan that people liked and people wanted to keep and could not because of the mandates that were put on by the Affordable Care Act. So I want to remind my friends from the other side of the aisle that maybe the thing to do is to wait and see what really is in the plan, because the devil is in the detail, and I think you may like it enough that you perhaps will even vote for this tax plan that does give a jolt to the economy and does help the American people, especially in the lower and middle income, to keep more of their hard-earned dollars in their pockets. And with that, I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. To my friend on the other side of the aisle, the gentlewoman from Tennessee, the reality is the truth hurts. This budget resolution totally abandons America's most cherished values and betrays its highest ideals. This extreme budget not only threatens programs for our veterans and hungry children, it makes drastic cuts to the Medicare and Medicaid programs that our seniors count on for survival. As it doles out that budgetary cruelty, this resolution hands massive tax cuts to millionaires and powerful corporations, all while adding $2.4 trillion to the deficit over the next decade. It also fails to protect our environment, neglects our children's education, and once more targets women's health care for severe cuts. In short, the wealthy win, the middle class is ignored, and we all get saddled with more debt. Those are not values that this House should stand for. It's certainly not what veterans, children, seniors, or hardworking Americans deserve. This irresponsible budget rewards the rich and powerful and punishes everyone else. And that's the best thing that I can say about it. And with that, I urge a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now am happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Jeffries.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Our House Democrats are focused on delivering better jobs, better wages, and a better future for the American people. House Republicans have once again presented a budget that is reckless, regressive, and reprehensible. It is a billionaire first, middle class last tax plan. It will not help the middle class. The House Republican budget and tax proposal will hurt the middle class by raising taxes on working families and middle income Americans. The House Republican budget and tax plan is nothing more than a wolf in sheep's clothing. It will benefit the wealthiest and the well-off here in this country. 80% of the tax cuts proposed in the Ryan-McConnell plan will go to the wealthiest 1% in America, to millionaires and billionaires, to the privileged few, to special interest corporations. It will not lead to economic growth. It will saddle this country with trillions of dollars in additional debt and deficit. And you know, it's based on a phony, fraudulent, and failed theory of trickle-down economics, which I finally figured out what it relates to in terms of the middle class. You may get a trickle, but you're guaranteed to stay down. Stay down because they're going to undermine your Medicare. Stay down because they're going to undermine Social Security. And stay down because they're going to saddle your children with trillions of dollars of additional debt. Reject this plan. It's a bad deal for the American people. They deserve a better
time
deal.
has expired. Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now it is my honor to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, a member of the Ways and Means, Mr. Roscoe.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Madam Chairman, I'm almost tempted to continue to yield time to my friend from the other side of the aisle. Just keep driving the expectations of any tax relief further and further and further into the ground. And I think people are going to be surprised and delighted with ultimately what the House ends up considering. Here's why I'm here. This is a prelude to tax reform. We vote on this, we then make it so that no single political party is able to deny a vote on tax reform, and both parties can come to the table and try and negotiate something that's thoughtful. Because here's what we know. It's the current tax code that is benefiting people that everybody is scandalized that they're benefiting. It's the current tax code that allows corporations to lock trillions of dollars offshore. It's the current tax code that is really stifling and so difficult, and it's the current tax code that nobody can defend. There is not a single person on this floor that is going to say, oh, the Internal Revenue Code, I love that, Mr. Chairman, just leave it the way it is, because it's a disaster. And nobody likes the IRS. So rather than moaning and groaning and having posters and this and that, let's do this. Let's dump the current tax code and let's have a transformational moment. And Mr. Speaker, that's what our country, that's what our constituents are yearning for. Not old bumper stickers, not old shabby phrases from the past, but they're looking for us to lead and to bring people together. And that's what we're trying to do. There's a nettlesome issue that affects my district as a high-tax state, and it affects a lot of other folks, and that is how we deal with state and local tax deductibility. And I'm of the view that tax reform does not mean simply the redistribution of a tax liability from one part of the country to another, but it means tax relief for everybody. And so I think what we're looking for is to create middle-class tax relief. And if the gentleman's expectation is that we're, are that low, I think he's going to be pleased with what we ultimately are able to come up with. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge an aye vote. I thank the gentlelady for the time, and I look forward to passing this resolution and move forward to changing our tax code. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Levin.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the Republican budget politically paving the way for their tax reform proposals can best be described as an elixir of growth, a magic cure-all, but instead it is a fake, indeed dangerous potion. History has shown that a huge tax cut, primarily for the very wealthy and large corporations, does not promote growth and will make life harder for the middle class and everyone else. This budget calls dangerously for raising our debt by $1.5 trillion, creating a future deficit tax for middle-income families, cutting Medicare by nearly $500 billion, cutting Medicaid and other health programs by $1.3 trillion, and assuming $4 trillion in cuts to a broad range of programs which could include education and health research. Vote no on this budget. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is now my honor to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman who is the chair of our RSC, the distinguished member from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am torn as I rise today. First, there's no question I will vote in favor of the budget and encourage my colleagues to do so, because there is no doubt this is the best way forward to achieve tax reform and unlock the promise of bigger paychecks, more jobs, and the return of investing in America. However, I must also include that the Senate did not do its work. After months of hard work by Chairman Black and the Budget Committee, the House was able to get it done. Even acknowledging the difficult position of our country, they put us on a path to balance in less than a decade. The House's budget included reconciliation instructions to speed up the enactment of $203 billion in mandatory savings. And the House budget included instructions that allowed us, for the first time, to stay on the path to repeal the Obamacare to help those who continue to suffer with rising premiums in the individual market. I would guess that Nearly every Republican in the chamber agrees that the House's budget is superior. So why are we voting on the Senate's? Because our Senate colleagues seem allergic sometimes to making tough choices. But why will the Senate's budget pass? Well, because the American people need tax relief. Families and small businesses wrestle with an outdated and complicated tax code every year. And it is true, we do have a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The specter of the IRS and devastating corporate rate mean that capital and resources are held outside of the United States and not invested here. Making our tax code fairer and simpler will bring this capital back to the market and jumpstart investment and growth like we have rarely seen in the United States. Despite my ongoing and deep frustration sometimes with the Senate, I encourage my colleagues to pass this budget and bring the promise of more jobs and bigger paychecks closer to reality. I am pleased by the Speaker's commitment that the House will vote on important fiscal legislation in the form of balanced budget amendments, Default Prevention Act, or some other deficit-reducing legislation. Bottom line, it is vital that the House fulfill its promise to the American people. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now am happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. The American people will look forward to a Thanksgiving and a Christmas of which families come together, but they'll also see a Halloween. Today on the floor of the House, the Republicans vote for the worst Halloween of hobgoblins and ghosts and monsters that you can ever imagine. Monsters scare children. And so today we'll be voting on that monster that will scare children. Let me let you listen to Senator Sykes from Kansas, her state offering a Republican tax cut that was going to boost the economy. Her words are, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say with certainty this promise was unfulfilled. In the following 5 years, Kansas experienced 9 rounds of budget cuts, stress on state agencies, and the inability to effectively provide the core functions of government for our citizens. What do you think will happen to this nation if we vote for this budget plan, this Halloween of a plan? Latest Republican budget mandates $4.9 trillion in spending cuts. Mr. Speaker, I cannot vote for this. I cannot vote for it because of the people in Texas after Hurricane Harvey, the people in Louisiana after Hurricane Nate, people in Puerto Rico after Maria and Irma, and the Virgin Islands and Florida. I cannot vote for this. This will gut disaster relief, education, infrastructure, research, veterans benefits, and it will clearly provide tax cuts for the rich. The Republican budget provides $1.6 trillion in tax cuts to millionaires, billionaires, wealthy corporations. It doesn't give any money for the middle class. It provides a exploding
Gentleman's time has expired.
Does the gentleman?
15 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. It explodes the deficit. How could this happen? It demands higher cuts to Medicare, Social Security, and education. This is a Halloween America will not tolerate. And my good friend from North Carolina, there will be over 1 million people that will lose benefits under this plan in the tax plan that they're planning. They will pay higher taxes. This is a bad bill. Vote it down. I yield back.
Time has expired. Gentleman reserves. Kentucky reserves. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Sir. The gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's now my honor to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores.
The gentleman is recognized.
So I thank Chairman Black, and I want to thank her and her committee for all the great work that they've done and putting forth a budget that moves America in the right direction. Mr. Speaker, I've been astounded by the rhetoric that we've heard from the other side for a plan that they haven't really seen. So they're making up their facts as they go along to suit their wishes. Mr. Speaker, I support the fiscal year 2018 budget resolution. While I think the Senate's version falls far short of the great work we did in the House on our budget, it's still the key thing that we need to have to move forward with tax reform for the American people. Our tax reform plan includes tax cuts for the working class Americans that have been struggling for the last several years under a broken tax code. It also makes America's businesses the most competitive in the world instead of having to struggle with the world's least competitive tax system. In summary, Mr. Speaker, this budget provides a way for a tax plan that provides for bigger paychecks, more jobs, a stronger economy, a balanced budget. I strongly urge our colleagues to support this budget. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time remains?
The gentleman from Kentucky has 12 3/4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am happy now to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Neal.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. It's getting time for Halloween, so they put on the disguise on the other side. So what we're hearing today is, from the last two Republican speakers, this is a bad budget, let's vote yes. The gentleman from Ohio said a while ago, this is all about the middle class. The middle class does not pay the estate tax. The middle class, because of our efforts, and I think mine in particular, they no longer pay alternative minimum tax. And the people in the middle class are not locked into the 39.6 top rate in the tax code. This is a disguise. They're adding $1.5 trillion to the debt, and actually over 10 years when you borrow the money, they're adding $2.3 trillion to the debt, all for a tax cut for people at the very top. Now let me say this. I am happy to negotiate a tax reform package that we can all live with. I am happy to sit down with the other side and acknowledge some parts of the code that clearly don't work any longer for the American people. This is being done by one party, exclusively. They have not negotiated with us. They have not given us the opening. They have not said to us, where do you want to proceed on this? Instead, if you pass this budget today, they suggest you're going to see their plan on November 1st, and you're going to vote for it sometime around November 6th. That is not negotiation. The Congress I signed up for actually negotiated these agreements, and if you couldn't love the final package, at least you could like it because you had sufficient input. That is not what's happened, Mr. Speaker, in this process. This process is one-sided. It's one-dimensional. They interchangeably use the word tax cut and tax reform. This is about a tax cut, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves.
Reserve.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I have been here. This is my 37th year. This is the most reckless and irresponsible budget that I have seen in the 37 years that I have been here. Today we are considering the Senate's budget resolution, not because the House supports it, but because it is just a vehicle to get partisan tax reform. Strike that. Tax cut. On an issue as consequential as tax reform, the Congress should not be rushing to meet self-imposed political deadlines without enough time to read and analyze its effects. More importantly, we should not be considering a bill to cut taxes that is partisan and that is as terrible as we are hearing the majority's proposal will be. I say that because we still haven't seen the full details of a bill that this resolution provides for Republicans to jam through on an expedited process. One they will reportedly introduce, mark up, and bring to the floor in a few legislative days we have left before Thanksgiving. Is the sunshine too bright for you? Even my friends on the other side of the aisle don't know exactly how bad it will be for their constituents. When asked about the details of the Republican bill, Representative Chris Collins, a Republican from New York, said, "We don't know, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know." That's a Republican member of Congress who's saying he has no idea what this bill is empowering. But we do know that based on a nonpartisan analysis of their framework, it will raise taxes on 47 million Americans. We know that 80% of the tax cuts will go to the top 1%. And we know as well that nearly half of all taxpayers with children, 44.5%, will see their taxes go up. Those same children will not be on the hook. Those same children will be on the hook for a $2.4 trillion cost. This is the biggest debt explosion of any bill that I have seen. Republicans, Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida, summed up today's vote as being for a budget. Hear this, my friends, on both sides of the aisle. This is Matt Gaetz, Republican, Florida, summed up today's vote as being for a budget that, quote, nobody believes in, so that we have a chance to vote for a tax bill that nobody's read. That's not what we should be doing. We ought to be working together to craft a bipartisan tax reform package that is revenue neutral. It will be the height of hypocrisy to say that you're for fiscal discipline and to vote for this budget. Let's not risk our fiscal future and the economic security of our people. Defeat this resolution.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlelady from Kentucky is recognized. Tennessee, I'm sorry.
Texas and Tennessee are kind of related. But thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now it is my honor to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished member of the Budget Committee from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the FY18 budget. I think that this is a very important step in doing something that this nation needs, and that is for the United States Congress and the President to pass tax reform. For way too long, our national economy has languished at a GDP growth that is far below historical averages. And one of the most important things that we've got to do is to grow our economy, because that leads to families being successful, rising wages, being able to have careers for themselves and their family members. And I believe that tax reform unlocks the American economy in a way that we haven't seen in decades. For far too long, we have looked at our tax code only through a set of domestic lenses and only looked at the rates, and we get into these ridiculous debates about the top bracket versus the lowest bracket, and we divide our nation. But for the first time, we are approaching our tax code through a set of global lenses that really give our American economy a chance to be competitive on the world stage. It's not simply about cutting rates. It's not simply about giving a break to one group or another, and to get away from this rhetoric. It is about creating the most vibrant place in the world to do business by reforming the code and creating fairness. And if we do that, and our American families succeed, and we see people moving from poverty into the middle class and from the middle class up, and we see entrepreneurs and we see new businesses and innovation, we are going to see growth in our economy like we've not seen in a generation. And the importance of that is it will give us the tools that we need to address the single biggest driver of our debt, and that is mandatory spending. And this body must have the political courage and integrity, along with the Senate, to address mandatory spending, to have an honest conversation about Social Security, about Medicare, about Medicaid, and most importantly about welfare entitlement reform. Because we can no longer trap generation after generation in poverty. We must create pathways out of poverty into the middle class for our fellow Americans. We can do this. We can be committed to it. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Illinois, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Tchaikovsky.
The gentlelady is recognized.
So regardless of what the Republicans say, their budget paves the way for trillions of dollars in tax cuts for millionaires, billionaires, and wealthy corporations. And who would pay for it? It would be the middle-class families, children, seniors, and people with disabilities. It would slash Medicaid by $1 trillion, threaten health care for 1 in 4 Americans. It would slash Medicare by $470 billion. And this budget proposes yet again to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Under the Republican tax plan, 1.9 million Illinoisans would no longer be able to claim state and local tax deductions. And nationwide, 47 million people in the middle class households making between $50,000 and $150,000 a year would pay more in taxes. And so I ask my colleagues, did you really come to Congress to take away health care and reduce income for middle-class families? If you care about anyone other than millionaires and billionaires, you need to vote no. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Vermont, a distinguished member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Welch.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I want to say 3 things about this budget. First, deficits matter. Deficits matter. This budget explicitly raises the deficit it admits to $1.5 trillion, more likely $2.5 trillion. That means that our children and our grandchildren are going to be the ones paying for this for the deficit that's added. Second, process matters. We're hearing a lot of talk about tax reform, but there has been no process. There is no bill. And we're about to vote on a so-called tax reform package that has not been explicitly print to paper. This is no way to do any business. We're making it up as we go along, and it's the same process that was used on health care. We went into committee with no bill and came out 27 hours later with 24 million people losing health care. There's been no process on this. And third, details matter. And the details that are leaking out are very punishing to the middle class. Anybody who is an income taxpayer in a state, a property taxpayer in a state, is going to lose that deduction. It's very tough on middle-class efforts to save for retirement. That's in play. Folks' deductions on their KEO plans, their 401k plans, are very much a part of the process that's going to lower this. Reject this plan.
Time's expired.
I yield back.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I almost can't sit here and not make a comment on my colleague's budget on the other side of the aisle. All of a sudden, they seem to be very concerned about deficits when, as a matter of fact, their budget assumed almost $1 trillion worth of deficits in their budget. I want to also say that our committee did a really good job in having a balanced budget, and we are obviously looking at a budget from the Senate that we're going to be taking up so that we can do tax reform. But they also, in addition to that, had $2 trillion worth of new taxes that they placed on the American people. So all of a sudden, this purity of worrying about these deficits just make me scratch my head and about raising taxes on the people when their own plan did the very opposite of what we're trying to do is cut taxes. They added $2 trillion worth of taxes. So I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time we have remaining?
Kentucky has 5 3/4 minutes.
5 and 3. I yield my.
The gentlelady from Tennessee has 5 1/4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. As we wind down our arguments here, once again, we've had a very fascinating discussion, and once again, we seem to disagree on virtually everything. For instance, I've heard from the other side many times over the last few days and today that we really can't say what the impact is, the claims that we're making about whether this bill will help the rich or help the middle class or help lower income individuals because we don't have the details. Well, that's absolutely correct. We don't have the details. But then if we don't have the details, how can the other side talk about the huge benefits that this proposal, this tax proposal, that is yet unwritten, will provide for the middle class? And how can they deny that it will benefit the wealthy disproportionately? We know from the outline that was released by the other side in recent weeks that they intend to eliminate the estate tax. The estate tax only benefits wealthy Americans, people with estates over $11 million for a couple. They want to eliminate the alternative minimum tax. We know the alternative minimum tax only affects wealthy individuals. There was one estimate that the 1 year of President Trump's tax return that we have, that in that year alone, the alternative minimum tax would, if it were repealed, would have saved him $30 million. So we know that affects very wealthy people. We know that if you reduce the top rate from 39.6% to 35%, that benefits very high income people. So we do have enough information to draw some pretty definite conclusions about the impact that the released outline will have on wealthy Americans, and we can draw some of the same conclusions about how it will hurt middle class Americans. If in fact the Republican tax bill repeals the deduction for state and local taxes, there will be in my state 500,000 people who will lose an average of $9,900 of deductions every year. So we absolutely know the impact that the proposal as we know it now will have, and I think it's fair, given that there will be no hearings on this bill, it is fair to raise the alarms about what the potential for this bill is. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is my extreme honor to yield 3 minutes to our Majority Whip, Mr. Scalise, who is a wonderful member of our conference, and it is my honor to yield 3 minutes to him.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and want to thank Chairwoman Black for her leadership on this budget. It's important that we do a budget, and it's always difficult to bring a budget forward because it represents the views that we have, and of course we in the House passed a budget that shows the country how we can get back to a balanced federal budget, how we can get our economy moving again, and how we can finally rebuild the middle class. And that, Mr. Speaker, is really what's at heart with this budget vote. This budget starts the process of actually going out and cutting taxes across the board so that middle-class families can have a better opportunity for the American dream. If you look over the last 10 years, we have seen our middle class evaporate in this country. And so many times we've seen company after company move jobs overseas. And anybody who's complained about that, and I've sure been angry about it, the first thing you do is you go ask them, why did you move the jobs overseas? And they say, because America's not competitive again. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, in the entire industrial world. And what it means is middle-class jobs being shipped to other countries. Now, we can complain about it all day, Mr. Speaker, but how about we actually do something about it? This bill starts that process, working with President Trump, who wants to bring those middle-class jobs back to America. We're talking about high-paying jobs, $60,000 to $150,000 a year jobs that left our country. We can bring those jobs back. That's what this vote is about. That's what this budget is about, starting the process to finally rebuild our middle class, to finally bring those jobs back, and finally to give a tax break to families who have been struggling for so long under slow economic growth. Let's actually grow our economy. Growing our economy is not just good for rebuilding the middle class and for those hardworking taxpayers who will get real relief under this bill, but also to our ability to reduce the deficit and finally get back to balanced federal budgets so that we can create a healthier economy and a healthier America. I urge everybody to vote yes on this budget, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now have the distinct honor of introducing and yielding 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, the Democratic leader, Ms. Pelosi.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Kentucky for yielding. I particularly want to recognize his extraordinary leadership as the ranking member on the Budget Committee. As we all know, a budget should be a statement of our national values. What is important to us as a nation should be reflected in how we allocate our resources. It's, again, a statement of values. Who better to manage all of that in this Congress of the United States than Mr. Yarmouth, who brings his values, his heartland priorities to the budget process, and I thank him for the leadership he has provided. Sadly, though, I rise in opposition to what the Republicans have proposed, a devastating Republican budget, the first step in the GOP's dangerous plan to fast-track their immoral tax framework, to hand trillions of dollars to the wealthy while raising taxes on working American families. The Republican budget and tax plan cruelly rigs an unfair system even further against hardworking Americans. It cuts a raw deal for families in every corner of our country. Democrats have a better deal, better jobs, better pay, better future. But right here before our eyes in this House, Republicans are replacing the great American ladders of opportunity with the silver spoons of plutocracy and aristocracy. Their agenda raises taxes on the middle class. That is the fact. Tens of millions of middle-class families will pay higher taxes, including a heavier burden for state and local taxes. And on that subject of SALT, state and local taxes, it might be interesting to our distinguished colleague, Mr. Solis, and isn't it a joy to see him in the debate on the floor. In his state of Louisiana, 458,000 people will pay nearly $7,000, an average of nearly $7,000 more by losing their deduction. And Congresswoman Black from the great state of Tennessee, in her state, 573,960 people will lose their deduction. The filers will lose their deduction, around $5,600 a filer. Not only that, if that isn't bad enough for assaulting the dream of home ownership in our country by attacking the deduction, this plan that the Republicans propose has been estimated to reduce the value of people's homes by 10%. So you not only are paying more money in order to give a tax break to the wealthy and to big corporations, you are reducing the value of your home and, by the way, your neighbors' homes as well. So with all of the unfairness in it, the one that is most understandable to people directly is how it affects them. And in that case, 44 million Americans will pay more because of what the Republicans have in their plan. So it raises taxes on the middle class, particularly with the state and local tax deduction removed. And by the way, another by the way, if you're a corporation, your deduction is not removed, just if you're an individual filer. So again, an advantage to corporate America at the expense of America's working families. Next, it borrows trillions from the future to give tax cuts to the wealthiest. 80% of the tax cuts in this Republican proposal go to the wealthiest 1%. 80% go to the wealthiest 1% at the expense of America's working families and children. The budget on the floor today reveals the true cruelty behind the Republicans' tax plan. What words would be best to use it? It's looting the middle class, massive looting of the middle class, rip-off of the middle class. You know why? Because there are many middle-class people. So you take from all those middle-class people and those who aspire to it so that you can give a lot of money to the few. A big sucking up from the middle class to the wealthy. I was not counting service on the national debt, which would take it closer to $3 trillion addition. That's a very hard road to come back from. And as our distinguished ranking member has pointed out, the opportunity cost in the budget, whether it's to $1 trillion from Medicaid, $500 billion from Medicare, funds taken from education, the seed corn of America's preeminence in the world. Why? To give a tax cut to the high end. And they'll say, oh, all the growth that come from this will pay for that. Never has. Never has. Don't take it from me. Bruce Bartlett, who was one of the orchestrators of the supply-side economics, said, we never said it paid for itself. To anyone who says it does, it's not true. It's nonsense. He went even further to call it BS. As I said, it ransacks Medicare and Medicaid, adding trillions to the debt and tax breaks for corporations and the wealthiest, looting the middle class, shaking down the middle class, ripping off the middle class, increasing the taxes of the middle class. So it devastates vital investments, as our distinguished ranking member have said, in good-paying jobs with higher wages for working families, the education of our children, the health of our working families. It really is a good example of what they say, that Medicare should wither on the vine. In keeping with their trickle-down economics, Medicare should wither on the vine because they will take some $500 billion from Medicare in their budget that will follow. So Republicans will harm veterans, rural America, seniors and children, again, all in the name of fast-tracking trillion-dollar tax breaks for the wealthiest 1%. 80%. What more do you need to know? 80% goes to the wealthiest 1%. Again and again on the floor, the Republicans have tried to tilt the playing field against hardworking families. This is really quite remarkable, though. This is a great transformative moment for America, where we can reject this assault on the middle class, this addition to the national debt, and instead say, let's go to the table and work in a bipartisan way to truly reform our tax code so that we can be competitive in the world, so that families can thrive, that they can have the deductions that are fair for them and needed, and not taken away from them, but not taken away from corporate America. So we stand ready to go in a bipartisan way to work to do this. Any tax cuts, because this is just tax cuts for the rich, this is not tax reform. Any tax cut, any agenda like that has to be bipartisan in order for it to be sustainable. So let's come to our senses here. Common sense says, well, mathematics says if you take a lot of money from many people to give it to a few, you are exacerbating the disparity of opportunity, equity, income in our country. This is a wrong thing to do. It's not what our values are about. It's really a shame that they would even bring such a document to the floor. And anybody who lives in a district where their deduction, the tax deductions for state and local taxes are taken away from individual filers, but not for corporations, as the bill determines, to the tune, and I can read you all the statistics across the country about how devastating this is. As our own governor said, how could they do that to our state or any state without the Department of Finance of our states saying, wait a minute, understand what this does to the economy of our state. Understand what this does to our individual filers in our state. Who said that this document that came over from the Senate should have such a devastating impact on states and members coming to the floor and endorsing it? Some say, oh, I'm just voting for the budget, but it really isn't what it meant. No. No, you are putting your name next to taking the deduction of home ownership, of state and local taxes away from your constituents. They're going to know that. I would rather you reject this. We don't want a political argument. We want to protect the American people. That's why I hope everyone here would come down in favor of the middle class and reject this assault, this ripoff, this shakedown of the middle class that the Republicans have on the floor. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlelady for Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's now my honor to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, we had a Democrat president, John F. Kennedy, who cut taxes when he was president. I think he'd take issue with a lot of the things that have been said by his own party. It's been 30 years since we addressed taxes in this country. President Ronald Reagan addressed it 30 years ago. We are way overdue for tax cuts in the United States of America. Everybody knows that the 35% tax rate on corporations has driven companies overseas. West Virginia saw just a couple of years ago one of our largest remaining corporate headquarters, Monmouth Pharmaceuticals, relocate overseas to avoid the taxes that are too high in this country. We all know that's a problem. We have a plan we're putting forward to try to solve it. I say to my friends on the other side of the aisle, where's your plan? You have no plan. This is all political. All you do is take political attacks. You've had meetings recently that said, don't offer a plan. Let's just attack the Republicans for their plan. At least we have a plan to address this, because hardworking taxpayers in West Virginia and America need and expect us to deliver on these tax cuts. So I rise in strong support of the budget today so we can move forward with our tax cut plan. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Reserve. We reserve.
Reserves. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized. You have 2.25 minutes remaining.
2 minutes, okay? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is now my delight to yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the distinguished member from Texas, Mr. Brady.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With this budget, we have an opportunity to move forward on a major priority for the American people, which is delivering the first overhaul of America's broken tax code in more than 3 decades. When you look at today, the way America is taxed, it doesn't take long to recognize this is completely and utterly broken. You can see it's so complex. It forces millions of families and job creators to spend billions of hours and dollars each year just filing their taxes. It's unfair. It gives wasteful Washington lobbyists loopholes and carve-outs to special interests by giving hardworking Americans nothing but frustration. And you can see our tax code is miserably uncompetitive. That's why more and more of our American businesses and good-paying jobs are going overseas to countries with more modern and more competitive tax systems. By passing this budget today, we can send a clear message to the American people: real tax reform is on the way. A no vote, as we heard from our Democrat colleagues, is to block tax reform and defend the status quo. We are working closely with President Trump as he leads this charge. Together we have bold ideas to deliver more jobs, fair taxes, and bigger paychecks for all Americans this year. I want to thank Chairman Black and the Budget Committee for all their hard work. I want to encourage my colleagues to vote yes on tax reform and join me in taking an important, historic step forward to deliver on our tax reform promise. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
We reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have no more speakers, and I'm ready to close.
Gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in closing, I would just like to say that for anyone watching this debate or watching any of our discussions out there in the country, I know it often appears that we don't get along, that we hate each other, that we're at each other's throats, but nothing could be further from the truth. And it's been such an honor to work with Chairman Black as a member of the Budget Committee and all the members. And we do all respect each other and get along. We just have some very serious disagreements about policy. That's fair. That's what this country is about. And once again, although I may not get to do it, since I may not get to do it again, as Chairman Black pursues another office and probably won't appear with me on the same program anymore, I just want to wish her the best and say what a joy it's been to work with her. And with that, we yield the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time I have left?
Seconds.
30 seconds. In 30 seconds, I want to once again say thank you to my colleague from the other side, and I've enjoyed working with him. Look, this is history. We're going to make history. I urge my colleagues to join me in their support of the budget, because doing so means that we can truly benefit the American people. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 580, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion offered by the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Mrs. Black. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
I request the yeas and nays, Mr. Speaker.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those in favor of your vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the 15-minute vote on the motion to concur will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1698. This is a 15-minute vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 216, the nays are 212. The motion is adopted without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is a vote on the motion of the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1698 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1698, a bill to expand sanctions against Iran with respect to the ballistic missile program of Iran and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.